Whenever something happens in the US, of course, I think all of us can recognize that it affects Canada here, since they're our neighbors, right? And in the colonial empire borders that Myrna mentioned, oh man, like the laws that get passed directly impact Indigenous peoples. I mean this specifically in terms of like today here in what is now called Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan, whenever incidents happen, there's this like increase of militarization of police, the military themselves, and then powers get extended. And then now today we're seeing conservation officers carrying AK-15s. If many of you don't know that, those are military style weaponry. They're weapons carried by the military and have caused a lot of havoc in the US. And yet now in Saskatchewan, the conservation officers carry them, you see. And then another law that was passed in Saskatchewan here is similar to the US stand your ground type of law. And it gives the private property owners less liability should they kill someone or injure someone alleged to be trespassing on their property. And this is a result of the expanded powers of the 9/11 terrible event. But in terms of the domestic powers that Canada now can reach into, that they passed from 9/11, it has impacted Indigenous people. You see that specifically with the Wet'suwet'en, the land back lane, and if you do the investigate the injunctions that are filed, you find that the corporations, their injunctions are more accepted and enforced by the court, and there's minuscule injunctions that are enforced by the court when Indigenous peoples go to seek intervention from the courts. So we're seeing this real flexing of the colonial state through the use of colonial powers since 9/11. And man, I'm telling you on a very personal level, it is scary and frightening as a brown person to go to the lands of my people, lands that we have always lived on, because now the hyper militarization, the hyper surveillance is very frightening, very frightening. And for the Canadians, I invite you to take a look at the changes in the landscape, to really scrutinize what is happening on the ground in places that your eyes do not see. I invited Dean Boddy and Professor Rogan to my people's lands before the pandemic. And I think it is safe to say that it really changed how they see law. Not that they didn't see it. I think being aware of what Indigenous peoples face in terms of colonial law is something, but to actually see it, to be taken to those places, it's very different. and to feel the tangible fear in the daily lives of Indigenous peoples, it's something very different. Like today, when I go out to the land to go hunting, to go fishing, and these actions are inherent. They're also protected by Treaty 6. We are very aware of that we're watched. Recently here, because of the expanded powers of the conservation officers, we had our Indian Act reservation surrounded by conservation officers because my people hunted and killed a moose in what they deemed to be a problematic area. And these are the everyday lives of Indigenous peoples. And this is, you wouldn't hear about these stories if people like me are not brought forward to your spaces. And I'm absolutely at times appalled at the lack of awareness that many Canadians have in terms of what is happening to Indigenous people since 9/11, and the absolute, in my opinion, violation that has increased against brown and black bodies through the use of the colonial powers that Canada has increased since 9/11. And there's been books written about the surveillance of Idle No More, the surveillance of other peoples who have questioned Canada's legitimacy and questioned Canada's actions. And there's been there's been a dialogue on it, and like I said, there's been books written about the hyper surveillance of Indigenous peoples whenever they have questioned Canada's legitimacy. And I think I don't want to say that the protection of people is not important. I do recognize that though there needs to be a balance of these competing challenges, if you will. And in those dialogues, I think it's important to understand that when Indigenous peoples are pushing back against the state, people need to recognize that we're not terrorists, that we're not committing violent acts. In fact, if you do research on Idle No More, there was not one violent act that was deemed a threat at all. No, none whatsoever. In fact, there was a lot of comments about how peaceful it is, but people don't recognize that it's because we know how violent the state can be. And whenever we have asserted our right to exist on these lands, the state really uses everything within its might to silence Indigenous peoples. For this day and for many days moving forward, my people fear even to have their vehicle broken down on the road because we cannot even ask the farmers to assist. We have to be prepared. There's chats created on social media on how to prevent yourself from getting shot by farmers, and those are things that you don't have access to that I do. We're trying to stop the death of indigenous peoples on our own. There's even the Bear Clan, we don't, and I don't know if you know this, but for indigenous peoples, in order to access the RCMP, we have to sign what is called CTAs, Community Tripartite Agreements. And we signed that agreement with the RCMP so that they will come to our community when we call them. You see? And they know a lot of times they don't come. They don't come. And the other thing that Trudeau did is he put into the RCMP mandate letter that they must address their racism. So I'm not sure how they're doing that. I wish there was a monitoring body a monitoring body to investigate and scrutinize how they're going about to deal with their racism. And that racism was a result of a lot of the footwork that brown and black bodies always seem to have to do. And it's I don't want all of you to leave this room feeling discouraged and asking, well, what can we do to support indigenous peoples? Just ask yourselves, like, why is Canada still an apartheid state? Canada is an apartheid state. And as soon as we start telling the truth, before we start jumping into reconciliation, I would encourage that strongly. Like, ask yourselves, like, why is Canada spending so much money, investing so much money in the militarization of the colonial state, and yet we don't have drinking water? The reserve that I'm registered in, I have to have bottled water in order to have clean water. How does that apply to what I'm talking about here? It has everything to do in terms of the violence against Indigenous peoples that Canada uses in terms of the colonial laws. And ever since 9/11, I've seen an absolute increase in militarization using colonial law to control and silence Indigenous peoples, and also in other areas such as the paramilitary assistance from security people that are hired to go into our lands to support the pillaging and extracting of resources that Canada does not own. So it just, the tentacles of the effects of 9/11 are just frightening for me, being on the land, trying to live as I have always lived, to fish and to gather and to hunt. This is integral to my people, and it's affected every day, because the fear of going out onto the lands is just, like I said, it's tangible. And even more so recently, the vigilantes that think they have the right to enforce, to be the arm of the police. And we see that in the US as well. We've seen that. All of you have seen how the vigilantes have gone to the rallies and the different things and the violence that has erupted. And, you know, it has increased the white supremacist groups. In my opinion, I see that. I see their activities are more blatant, more open. They're not as fearful. They're out there. They're in our faces over here in Saskatchewan. They're not hiding. Some of them are even proud of being white supremacists. And, you know, in Canada, the support for the white supremacist has increased. I cannot even tell you how do you describe those kind of situations, right? Anyway, I'm say this from a place in which I face white supremacy and racism in the province of Saskatchewan. The nickname for Saskatchewan is the Little Mississippi. So that gives you an idea of how much racism exists here and it's growing. It's growing. The white supremacist groups are growing. So, yeah. Thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate it. And my view and the understanding that I have as a law professor and what I do see as an Indigenous person, the effects of 9/11 and what the colonial states have done in terms of utilizing law and weapons to control and attempt to label brown and black bodies who resist empire the violence has increased. It's really increased a lot. So thank you for listening to me. And thank you.